We're on a mission and we're having a minute.
The chairman is sitting on that. Change his chair all the time.
Okay.
And he said, wherever I sit, this is the table.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. We're going to start. We're starting part 2 of our introduction to the introduction. Okay. So here's additional copies. We left off with 2 questions last week, which will lead into many more questions. Number 1, we pointed out that the Rambam believes that it is the duty of every Jew to have clarity to some degree in Ma'aseh V'Reishit and Ma'aseh Merkava, in the act of creation and in the act of the chariot. Just wants to clarify. Someone had asked me last time, what does the act of the chariot mean? And I mentioned that it has to do with the first chapter of Ezekiel. The truth is that the Ma'aseh Merkava is clarified, according to many Meforshim, in a number of passages, both in Sefer Yeshaya and in Sefer Daniel and in Sefer Yechezkel and in other sources as well. So it's really, all of them are the prophetic descriptions of visions of Hashem or his manifestations to us in this world. But the Rambam says that this is the project that he is going to be engaging in when he writes the Moreh Nevukhim. And we pointed out that the Rambam is not a new person when he writes the Moreh Nevukhim. He actually had this idea that expounding on certain concepts that have to do with an intellectual understanding of Hashem and his universe is the duty of every Jew. And as we're going to point out from our analysis of the first 4 chapters of Mishnah Torah, he felt it was the primary project and the primary responsibility of every Jew, and almost as a prerequisite to the understanding of Torah and mitzvahs. We also pointed out last time that according to the Rambam, Aristotelianism really is an expounding on Ma'aseh V'Reishit and Ma'aseh Merkava. That is, the Rambam truly and genuinely believed that the study of this discipline is not sort of an accompaniment to a study of Torah, but it is part and parcel of Torah. And as we'll see from the language of the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam actually believes that there are certain aspects of our esoteric tradition, of Torah Sheba'al Peh, that is very deep and very mysterious, that was never really committed to writing, so that some of it was lost along the way. And the Aristotelians were able to pick up on a lot of this, repackage it, put it into different verbiage, and therefore it is by us recapturing it or sort of reincorporating it within our knowledge of Torah, we're sort of restoring the Torah back to where it's supposed to be. And therefore for the Rambam, it's not that I study 2 disciplines, secular and Kodesh, but everything is Kodesh. Studying Aristotle is an endeavor in Talmud Torah. There's actually Menachem Kellner, Professor Kellner from University of Haifa, has a funny question. He says, could the Rambam study Aristotle in the bathroom? Right? Because for the Rambam, Aristotle was Talmud Torah, right? So it's an interesting thought question, but it's just the interesting way of phrasing it. So we left off with 2 questions last time. Question number 1 was, why does the Rambam feel at liberty to, number 1, put this at the beginning of Mishnah Torah, a discussion of Ma'aseh Bereishis and Ma'aseh Merkava, as we're going to get into in just a moment, when after all, Mishnah Torah is a project of codifying the halachas of the Torah. And if you're codifying halacha, how a Jew is supposed to behave, why start off with a discussion of Aristotelianism at the very beginning of that work? And the second question that we asked is, if we learned in the Mishnah last week in Maseches Chagiga that a person is not supposed to share this information, right? You have to be very, very careful about Maaseh Bereshit, but you have to be even more careful with Maaseh Merkava. With Maaseh Bereshis, we said you're not allowed to study it with two students, and Maaseh Merkava, you can't even study it with one student unless that student is very wise and already discerning on his own. So what right does the Rambam have to expose this information en masse to the public? So those were the two questions that we left with, and Gershon asked, Dr. Green had asked a very interesting question, which is, what do we do when we discover that Aristotle is no longer the science of the day? And how do we reconcile that? We're going to get to that question. Remember, you asked that question at the very end. So before we go any further, let me just show you where the Rambam says that Aristotelianism forms the basis of his understanding of both Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereshit. Just take a look at your handout. And those of you who are watching online, all of these texts are available on Sefaria.org. Is it Sefaria.org or Sefaria.com? I think it's .org. And just go to the Halacha section, select Mishnah Torah, and go to the first section of Hilchot Deot, Laws of Knowledge, and you'll be able to find chapter 1, the text that we're about to explain. So the first 4 chapters, I'll break them down for you, but we're just going to look at the very beginning and the very end of the first 4 chapters, and for the sake of brevity, we're going to be learning the texts in English, even though there would be a lot to gain by learning it in Hebrew, because the Rambam did write this text in Hebrew, but I just think for the sake of brevity, we need to move. So he says, the foundation of foundations and firmest pillar of all wisdom is to know that there is a first being, that he caused all things to be, and that all beings from heaven and earth and from between them could not be save for the truth of his own being. That's the first thing you need to know. Now, of course, the Rambam is essentially codifying what a Jew has to know. And that in itself is very interesting, because normally we associate halacha with physical practice, and the Rambam tells us that there's halachos of things that go on, there's halachos of epistemology, of my mind, the workings of my mind. And one of the obligations that I have is to know certain things. And so the first thing I need to know is that there is a God who is the source of everything and responsible for everything that exists. Thus, supposing that he is not, none else could have been called into existence. Conversely, supposing all other beings, save he alone, non-existent, his being alone remains. That means if we were to imagine that everything were to cease to exist, Hashem would never cease to exist. Everything else can cease to exist, but not Hashem. For he does not cease to be because of their non-existence, as all beings are dependent upon him, but he, blessed is he, is not dependent upon them, nor upon a single one of them. Therefore, the truth of his being is incomparable to the truth of any other individual being. That God's essence, God's existence, is unlike any other thing's existence, because every other thing's existence is dependent upon Hashem, but Hashem is not dependent upon anything. He is the completely independent existence. We're skipping the rest of that first chapter, but just to review, or just to give you a brief synopsis of what the remainder of that first chapter of Hilchos Deis is, the Rambam goes into the mitzvahs aseh, providing us with textual sources of how I know that there's a mitzvah to have this knowledge, to know that there is God. Then the Rambam launches into a discussion of God's unity, his achdus, which is one of the most important features of Hashem's essence. The next thing that the Rambam discusses in this chapter is what for the Rambam is absolutely vital, which is God's incorporeality, that there is no physical aspect to God whatsoever. By the way, believe it or not, even though we take this for granted, this got the Rambam into some hot water. Because when you think about it, what about all of the biblical references to Hashem's physical body, right? That Hashem took us out of Egypt, biyad chazaka uvizroa nituya. that God took us out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And what about the fact that it says, like even in Parshas Noach, Vayered Hashem l'ros es ha'ir ve'es hamigdal, that God descended in order to see what was going on. You can only descend if you're confined to spatial confinements. So the Rambam says, and this is the rest of the chapter of chapter 1, is that all of the references to God being confined to space or God having some spatial or physical qualities is all metaphor. It's all metaphor. Now, this an allegory. This is also problematic because normally ein hamikra yotze midei pshuta, that you normally don't remove a pasuk from its simple import. And yet the Rambam says, but yes, when it comes to God, you have to take these psukim metaphorically. You cannot take them literally. Okay, let's go on to chapter 2. It is mandatory to love and fear this glorified and awe-inspiring God, for it is said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God. And as it is said, the Lord thy God thou shalt fear. So the second chapter begins with the mitzvah of ahava and the mitzvah of yira, that an individual has an obligation to both love and fear Hashem. But how may one discover the way to love and fear him? When man reflects concerning his works and his great and wonderful creatures, and will behold through them his wonderful, matchless, and infinite wisdom, he is spontaneously filled with love, praise, and exaltation, and becomes possessed of a great longing to know the great name. As David said, my soul thirsts for God, for the living God. And when he will think of all these matters, he will be taken aback in a moment and stricken with awe, and realize that he is an infinitesimal creature, humble and dark, standing with an insignificant and slight knowledge in the presence of the All-Wise. As David said, for when I see thy heavens, the wonderful works of thy fingers, of what use is man that thou mayest remember him? And in harmony with these matters, I elucidate great general principles of the works of the Lord of the universe, so that they might serve as an opening for one who understands by which to love the name. As some sages said on the subject of love, out of it thou wilt recognize the one who spoke, and the universe was called into existence. So the Rambam says a number of things in this second paragraph of the second chapter. Not only is there a mitzvah to love and fear God, but the question is obvious. How can I be commanded to love something or someone? You have to love me. I either love you or I don't love you. I either fear you or I don't fear you. How can I be commanded to be placed into an emotional state? So the Rambam's answer to that is that it all comes through an understanding of God. The more I understand who Hashem is, the better I will come to love him and fear him. So this is why this is part of Hilchot Deot, that I have to know Hashem. To know him is to love him, to use the song, right? That if you know Hashem and you understand what he has done and who he is, what his essence is, the greater your understanding, the greater your ahava, and the greater your yira. The greater your love, the greater your fear. And therefore, as a result, says the Rambam, I therefore feel it is my duty to reveal some aspects or some information about Hashem's essence, because the more you will understand by studying my texts, the more you will be able to love and fear Hashem. So the Rambam feels that what he's doing is a great service. Performing a great community service here by giving you some insight into Hashem's true essence. Let's go to paragraph 3. All that which the Holy One, blessed is he, created in his world is divided into 3 types. Composite creatures of matter and form. They are things which undergo constant changes as the bodies of man, beasts, plants, and minerals. Now, before I go to the second and third, let me just point out what matter and form means. These are Aristotelian concepts. For some of you, they may be very familiar. But for other people, they're very foreign. Chomer and Surah are matter and form. Those are terms that you will find throughout the writings of the Rambam, but you will find them throughout many writings, many other philosophical, theological writings among the Rishonim and even the Achronim. The Maharal was one of the last. He lives in the 16th century. He's one of the last of the Aristotelians because he's on the cusp of the Renaissance period. But everyone up until that period of time was referring to existence in terms of a duality, matter and form, that there are two things that comprise everything that exists in the physical plane. You have the matter, which is the physical material, and you have the form, which is the non-physical, intellectual essence that is placed into the object to give it its shape, to give it its features. So just to take a simple example, a chair. A chair is comprised of matter and form. Let's say the chair is made of wood. So the matter of the chair is just plain raw wood. But the form of the chair is the shape, the contour, all of the different aspects of the chair. Now, where did the form of the chair come from? It came from the mind of the carpenter, who imbued within a shapeless piece of wood, imbued it with, using his chisel and his hammer, imbued it with, and his, putting it together and gluing it and everything, imbued it with the idea of a chair that he had in his mind, and placed that intellectual concept of chairness and put it into a piece of wood. And that's how you get matter and form together. Now, this is a very in-depth topic, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on, but I just wanted you to know that this is the world in which the Rambam lives. This is Aristotelian physics, as far as just the way the world functions. So there are three types of beings in the world. Composite creatures of matter and form. They are beings which undergo constant changes as the bodies of man, beasts, plants, and minerals. B, composite beings of matter and form which do not undergo changes of either body or form as the former, but their forms remain forever set in their body unchanged. They are the planets and the stars around them. Their matter is unlike other matter, and their forms are unlike other forms. And C, beings possessed of forms but of no matter whatever. They are the angels, for the angels are incorporeal but varied forms. So really the reason why the Rambam is introducing this idea of matter and form is because part and parcel of chapter 2 of Hilchos Deos is not only an explanation of how we're supposed to love and fear God, but also that there are other incorporeal beings that Hashem created that are not part of the physical plane. And those are the angels, the malachim. And that's really where the Rambam is going in chapter 2. Chapter 1 is all about God, and chapter 2 is about how we're supposed to associate with God through our knowledge, and that there are other incorporeal beings that God created, and they are known as angels. And the Rambam, we're going to hold it over here. We'll fill in just a synopsis of the remainder of chapter 2 as follows. The Rambam then provides information about the different classes of angels, and then he tells us that angels are intelligences, which means they are pure intellect. That's what is meant by form, because the idea of Aristotle's form is that you take something that exists on an intellectual level and you usually imbue it within the physical realm, but something can exist independently of the physical and just be pure intellect. That's what an angel is, okay? And therefore, anytime you find the Torah or Tanakh describing the angels in any kind of corporeal form, like Bilam's vision of the angel, or Isaiah's vision of the angels with wings, or Ezekiel's vision of the angels with wings, and so forth, those are all imaginary visions of the mind. The angels never manifest themselves physically, but they are only what a person sees in his mind as the vision or sort of a representation of something which has no physical nature whatsoever. That's what an angel is, according to the Rambam. The Rambam also makes sure that we understand that even though angels are totally incorporeal and therefore are very similar to God in that sense, everything is a product of Hashem, and even angels have no independence in their existence from Hashem. And finally, at the end, towards the end of this chapter, the Rambam then describes Hashem's knowledge. Hashem's knowledge is different from everyone else's knowledge, that Hashem and his knowledge are one, which is again an esoteric idea bordering on philosophical concepts, which we're not going to delve into right now. We then go to the very end of chapter 2. And so in paragraph 11 of chapter 2, the Rambam writes as follows: these matters we spoke of on this subject in these 2 chapters are but a drop in the ocean of what it ought to be expounded in this subject. And the exposition of all the principles of these 2 chapters are known as what? Ma'aseh Merkava, the work of the chariot. In other words, what I've just described for you in discussing God and other incorporeal beings and God's knowledge and God's essence, this is all speculation and a discussion of Ma'aseh Merkava. I've given you Ma'aseh Merkava. Wow. This Rambam's getting himself into a lot of trouble over here. What are you doing, the Rambam? Didn't you learn the Mishnah that says you're not supposed to reveal Ma'aseh Merkava? So what's going on? But the Rambam is very clear. Now, we also explained that using this Aristotelian language, the Rambam understands that Ma'aseh Merkava is what Aristotle would call metaphysics, a description of that which exists in the above the physical plane, right? In the incorporeal form-only plane. Now, paragraph 12. The ancient sages have commanded not to sermonize concerning these matters. You're not supposed to expound on these. Now, you see that the Rambam writes that it's shelo lidrosh bidvarim. So already we're getting an answer as to why the Rambam feels at liberty to tell us Ma'aseh Merkava. He's not darshaning Ma'aseh Merkava. In other words, he's not going into full detail into what Ma'aseh Merkava is. He's not giving us long sermons. He's basically giving us a bare bones thumbnail sketch of what Ma'aseh Merkava is. And that's okay, says the Rambam. I'm not being darshaning, right? Save only to one man at a time, if he be wise, possessed of an intelligence of his own, when after to him might be transmitted the headlines of the chapters and acquaint him with a fraction of the matter, so that he be able to understand its conclusion by his own intelligence and fathom its depth. And so what the Rambam is essentially saying is, I'm not even providing you with the headlines. I'm just giving you like the first word of the headlines. And if you were my private student, I would be telling you a little bit more. These matters are, these matters are extremely deep matters indeed, and not each and every intelligence is prepared to suffer them. And concerning them, Solomon in his wisdom metaphorically said, the lambs will be for thy clothing. So have the sages interpreted this metaphor. Matters which are covering the universe shall be for thy garments, meaning they are a garment for you alone, but you shall not sermonize them before the multitude. And concerning them he further said, let it be for you alone and for no strangers with you. And concerning them he moreover said, milk and honey shall be beneath thy tongue. So have the early sages interpreted it. Matters which are likened to honey and milk, meaning the very esoteric aspects of Torah, shall remain underneath your tongue. Don't share them with others. Yes, go ahead.
And the Moreh Nevukhim is like an expansion of Nevukhim.
So that's when we learn the introduction to the Moreh Nevukhim, we will see that the Rambam is sort of expanding for one student. He's expanding on Ma'aseh Bereshit and Ma'aseh Merkava. But so far, the Rambam has just told us what it is. And therefore, I'm allowed to tell you what it is, right? It's an understanding of God and also all the totally incorporeal, form-only world. But that's it. Now we go to chapter 3. Yes?
Sorry, but I thought the idea of God to the perplexed would be for all the Jews that were perplexed by all the Islamic philosophers.
It could be, but we'll have to see when we get to the introduction. Okay. Hagalgalim. Okay. Chapter 3. Isn't there a song about Galgalim? Oh, Hine Rakevet Imistovevet. Al Galgalim, right? But this Galgalim is a totally different Galgalim, right? Galgalim in medieval philosophy means the celestial spheres. This too is a foreign concept to all of us, because the Rambam is now going to launch into a discussion of the physical realm, and the most ethereal of the physical realm are the celestial spheres. Now, what do we mean by celestial spheres? When you and I look up in the sky, we know that there is an atmosphere and there is nothing but air or even a lack of air in outer space between us and the stars. I could take a rocket ship, go straight up. If I had enough fuel, I could go straight up to one of those stars or Jupiter or Mars and land on it. We have the technology now to land on Mars, right? So we know that there's nothing opaque, there's nothing to block our passage to go up to the stars. But that was not Aristotelian science. Aristotelian science believed in the concept of celestial spheres, which is a series of concentric, transparent spheres. Just imagine a bunch of clear plastic beach balls, each of different sizes, inside of each other. Some say there are 9, some say there are 18. The numbers are not important, but it's a series of concentric spheres. And then you take a magic marker, and on one of those spheres you draw a series of stars, and another one of those spheres you might draw other stars. And in that way, the ancients understood the rotation of the stars has to do with the rotation of these clear plastic beach balls. And that's why you see motion. You see motion because these spheres are constantly moving and constantly in motion. That was, and by the way, it was extremely accurate from an astronomical navigational mode. This was a very accurate way of being able to maneuver and calculate where the stars would be. But that was the understanding until very relatively recent, it's the 17th, 18th century, when we have Galileo and Copernicus and Newton, and they totally revolutionize our understanding of what's out there, okay?
Do they believe in like beach balls or domes? Is the Earth the center?
The Earth, right, the Earth is the center of these spheres. They understood that the Earth is in the center and that these were concentric spheres. They're called galgalim because a galgal is a wheel.
The sun was on one of those spheres.
The sun is on one of those spheres, correct.
So the Rambam,
and the moon is on one of those spheres.
Sorry, the Rambam is treating the galgalim as a fact.
Yes, this is scientific fact.
Okay.
It's as if today I were to tell you that quantum physics is a fact. We know it's a fact because it's the way that we're able to put a man on the moon, right? So it's a fact.
And therefore he needs no source for this because he's treating it as a fact.
Right. Not only does he treat it as a fact, but he treats it as Torah. And that's even more of a fact. In other words, what is this doing in Mishnah Torah? It's part of our esoteric tradition that this is the way the universe functions. And you need to know this because the way that you're able to fulfill the mitzvah of the knowledge of God is to understand his universe. Okay? So this is a holy endeavor. This is not a secular endeavor. That's what we want to emphasize. Okay, we need to rush because we're running out of time. The celestial spheres are called heaven, firmament, habitation, and nebula, as there are 9 such spheres. The sphere nearest to us is the moon, and et cetera, et cetera. The Rambam then discusses in the rest of chapter 3 the science of astronomy and the trajectory of the stars. And he writes, when he finishes this discussion of the motions of the celestial spheres, he says, V'zohi chochmas cheshbon tekufos umazolos. He says, this is how the ancients were able to calculate the motions of the stars and the mazalos, which are the astrological signs. Usfarim rabim chiberu bahen chachmei Yavan. And he writes that many books about this science were composed by the Greek ancients, the Greek wise men. He also talks about the galgalim in terms not only of physical spheres, but also in terms of intelligences. And he says that just like I mentioned that the angels are pure form and are comprised of just pure intellect, the galgalim also have intellect as well. They have a sentience, and they are aware of their motion and their function and their relationship to Hashem. They too sing Shira to Hashem because this is part of their self-awareness. They are less of an intellect than the angels as described in Nach, but their level of intelligence is greater than man's, a great level of awareness. And then finally, at the end of chapter 3, the Rambam explains how these spheres not only contribute to the motions of the celestial bodies, but also how they influence matter, the physical forms of things in this world, because they in some way affect the four basic elements of fire, air, water, and earth. Okay? That's the end of chapter 3. Then we go to chapter 4. In chapter 4, we'll just look at the first paragraph. The Rambam writes, again, a discussion of the four elements, fire, air, water, and earth, are the elements of all the creatures beneath the expanse. All that be, when he means beneath the expanse, is beneath the innermost sphere closest to our planet, closest to the earth. All that be, whether of man, beast, fowl, creeping thing, fish, vegetation, minerals, precious stones, pearls, structural stones, etc., 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 are all connected to these four elements in some way. The Rambam then talks about the nature of the four elements. He talks about this idea of form and matter, which I've described to you before. And he talks about now how man is comprised of form and matter. Man's matter is his physical body, and his form is his neshama. That the intellect and the neshama for the Rambam are used interchangeably. Now, as we'll see, when we start learning the Moreh, it becomes more complex because there are multiple components of the neshama, and there are multiple components of the intellect, and we'll see how they line up with each other. But ultimately, the neshama and the intellect are both the form of man, in using this dual definition of everything being comprised of form and matter. Now we skip to paragraph 10, and this is really the vital parts that we need to go into now. All these matters we spoke of on this subject are but a drop in the bucket, and they are very deep matters. Remember, he said that before when he talked about metaphysics, but are not of the same depth as the subjects in chapters 1 and 2. The exposition of all these matters in chapters 3 and 4 is called cosmogony. Thus did the ancient sages charge not to sermonize on these matters before the multitude, but to impart them to one man and instruct him therein. But what do we call this in our terminology? Not cosmogony, but rather what? Maaseh Bereshis. This is the act of creation, an understanding of how the physical world works and its connection ultimately back to God. And wherein is the difference between the subject of works of the chariot and the subject of Maaseh Bereshis, of cosmogony? The subject of works of the chariot shall not be imparted even to an individual, unless he be a scholar endowed with a reasoning power of his own, and then only the epitomes of each chapter may be transmitted to him. Whereas the subject of Maaseh Bereshis may be imparted to an individual, even though not endowed with a reasoning power of his own, and it is permissible to teach him all that he is capable of knowing concerning these matters. If so, why not give public instructions therein? Because not every man is endowed with broad understanding to construe the explanation and elucidation of all the text correctly. Okay, very good. So Maaseh Bereshis is easier to grasp, but it's not as esoteric as Maaseh Merkava. Paragraph 12. When man contemplates concerning these things and perceives all creatures, whether angel, sphere, or man, the likeness of himself, and discovers the wisdom of the Holy One, blessed is he, in all beings of form and in all creatures, his love for the omnipresent increases, and his soul and body thirst and yearn to love him, blessed is he. And fear and terror, because of his own insignificance, shortcomings, and levity, seize him when comparing himself to one of the great and holy bodies, verily so to one of the pure forms, separated from bodies of clay, which never joined a body of clay. He then will find himself likened to a vessel full of shame and disgrace, empty and wanting. And that is the objective. The objective here is that when my intellect is enriched with a knowledge of Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereshis, I become a Torah Jew attitudinally. I become filled with ahava, and I become filled with yira. And that's why this is a holy endeavor. Okay? That's why this is a holy endeavor. Now today, if I wasn't going to launch into Aristotelianism because I have a different concept of the way the universe works, would still not this be of the same ethic, the same value? By going out to a planetarium and studying the stars and contemplating the essence of the universe, should that not also fulfill the same objective of filling me with awe and filling me with a love for the majesty of God's creation? Certainly it should. And so then the question becomes, well then why isn't that part of yeshiva curriculum? But I digress. Now we can take that all into another topic. But of course it should. In other words, unfortunately, the Rambam would be very disappointed in the way that we educate our children. We have limudei kodesh and we have limudei chol. But for the Rambam, everything is limudei kodesh.
But doesn't the Rambam say you only darshan it to one person at a time, not the whole class?
So what is he doing? What is he doing in Mishnah Torah? What is he doing in Mishnah Torah? How does he have the chutzpah to even write a sefer and share this with millions of people? How can he do this? So, as we mentioned before, we have to answer that question. So we've started to answer the question. And the way that we start answering the question is that the Rambam views this not as an expounding upon Ma'aseh Bereishis, which is what the Chazal said you're not allowed to do, but rather just explaining it and allowing you to glean the majesty of Hashem's world by your own introspection, to take us out and to tell us this is what exists in the world, is not being doresh b'ma'aseh bereishis. It's just explaining what exists. And for the Rambam, that's not part of the prohibition. To go deeper into it, to go uncover levels that were hidden that were never exposed, that's what's not okay. Now, really, this last paragraph is the most important. But I know that some of you have to go. So I'm going to just open up the floor for one or two questions, and then we'll save this last paragraph for next time. Any questions, comments?
So, the Kuzari also starts with the discussion of corporeality, right? I mean, when he starts talking, I mean, I was struck by the fact that both the Rambam and Yehuda Levi start in that same part. I wonder whether it's a function of the time they're writing in times that are not totally dissimilar.
They're writing in very similar times. They're separated by a generation,
right.
And that was the zeitgeist of the time, that God is incorporeal, and you must accept that because that's what was generally accepted as the science of its day, right? There were earlier Rishonim who were corporealists and did believe that God can manifest himself in certain ways. But that has become so expunged from our canon of theology that it almost seems like it's avodah zarah to even suggest it. But we would not be historically accurate if we were to say that no one ever believed that in Jewish thought.
They both felt that they had to expunge that view.
Yeah, perhaps they did, yeah.
The Shemona Parachim. It's very much what you were talking about in terms of creation, but creation of a person is a Torah person.
Yeah.
His action.
Right. The Shemona Parachim's project is different from the project that the Rambam is engaging in here. Shemona Parachim is a project in ethics, and therefore it's a way of helping a person become a more ethical individual, but also based upon Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics and Al-Farabi's explanation of the Nicomachean ethics. But we'll talk about that another time. I wish you a good day. Save these handouts because we're going to just look at the last paragraph of the 4th chapter next time.